Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, June 1st, 2023. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says he will keep the Senate in session for as long as it takes to pass the legislation that suspends the debt ceiling, as both Republican and Democratic senators say they would like to offer amendments. Treasury Department says the Senate has until Monday to raise or suspend the debt ceiling to avoid a U.S. default on the debt. The bill before the Senate is titled the Fiscal Responsibility Act and would also cut federal spending. House passed the bill Wednesday night, and President Biden says he will sign it into law if the Senate passes it. Also today, the Senate passes a bill that would nullify the president's plan to forgive federal student loans up to $20,000 per borrower. The House passed this bill last week. The president says he'll veto that bill. And President Biden giving the commencement address at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, telling the graduates that they now have the great privilege of leading in a challenging world that is rapidly changing. From the Associated Press, days away from a default crisis, the U.S. Senate dashed on Thursday to wrap up work on a debt ceiling and budget cuts package that overwhelmingly cleared a House vote, aiming to send it to President Joe Biden's desk to become law before the fast-approaching deadline. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said the chamber was digging into the bill that President Biden negotiated with Speaker Kevin McCarthy and would keep working until the job is done. He warned of a crush of ideas from senators anxious to revise the bill's budget cuts and environmental policy changes, but said there is no good reason, none, to bring this process down to the wire. That from Associated Press. Here is Senator Schumer on the floor this morning.
Last night, a large majority of both Democrats and Republicans in the House passed bipartisan legislation to protect the U.S. economy, protect American families, and eliminate the threat of a first-ever default. The bill is now in the Senate, where we begin the process today of passing this legislation as soon as possible. The Senate will stay in session until we send a bill avoiding default to President Biden's desk. We will keep working until the job is done. Time is a luxury the Senate does not have if we want to prevent default. June 5th is less than 4 days away. At this point, any needless delay or any last-minute holdups would be an unnecessary and even dangerous risk. And any change to this bill that forces us to send it back to the House would be entirely unacceptable. It would almost guarantee default. So again, the Senate will stay in session until we send a bill avoiding default to the President's desk, and we will keep working until the job is done. The vast majority of senators recognize that passing this bill is supremely important. It's about preserving the full faith and credit of the United States. There is no good reason, none, to bring this process down to the wire. No good reason to bring this process down to the wire. And that, too, is dangerous and risky. So today, I hope we see a genuine desire to keep this process moving quickly. I hope we see nothing even approaching brinksmanship. The country cannot afford that right now. Instead, I hope we see bipartisan cooperation. Bipartisanship is always the best way to avoid default and get this bill over the finish line. We've said it over and over again. Bipartisanship is what prevented default under President Trump. It's what prevented default under President Biden. And it's what will prevent default in this case, too. Partisan bills and hostage-taking, meanwhile, were never going to win the day.
Senator Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, the majority leader on the Senate floor. This legislation, as an article in Politico describes it, would raise the debt ceiling through 2024, install 2 years of budget caps, increase some work requirements on government benefits, rescind some IRS funding from Democrat party line legislation last year, and approve the Mountain Valley Pipeline from West Virginia into Virginia. The House passed it Wednesday night by a vote of 314 to 117. It was a bipartisan vote on both the yes and no sides. Voting yes, 165 Democrats and 149 Republicans, and voting no, 71 Republicans and 46 Democrats. Today, the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said he supports the bill, and he, too, would like to get an agreement with senators to hold some votes on amendments and then get to a vote on final passage.
Last night, an overwhelming majority of our House colleagues voted to pass the agreement Speaker McCarthy reached with President Biden. In doing so, they took an urgent and important step in the right direction for the health of our economy and the future of our country. The Fiscal Responsibility Act avoids the catastrophic consequences of a default on our nation's debt. And just as importantly, it makes the most serious headway in years toward curbing Washington Democrats' reckless spending addiction. The bill the House just passed has the potential to cut federal spending by $1.5 trillion. Now the Senate has a chance to make that important progress a reality.
The Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, on the Senate floor. With the latest on the debt ceiling and spending bill in the Senate, joining us on the phone is Paul Krozak, senior writer with CQ Roll Call. Thanks for being with us. So which senators want what to not hold up this bill?
Well, there are a number of senators who they're concerned about defense spending not being high enough. That's probably the main concern. They want various things. There are a number of amendments that are being proposed, and we will probably see, we don't know how many, maybe a dozen or less than a dozen votes on amendments. But Republicans in particular are concerned that the defense increase is not enough. It goes up to the level of President Biden's budget request for next year, but then after that it would just be a 1% increase. So there are requests for a commitment from Democratic leaders that they will provide more defense funding in a Ukraine supplemental. On the other hand, there are Democrats such as Patty Murray who say if we're going to have a Ukraine supplemental, it has to be about more than just Ukraine. We have to include other things like disaster aid. So defense really is the big hang-up here. There are some other concerns as well.
One of the amendments that has been talked about, Senator Tim Kaine, a Democrat, upset at that pipeline that runs from West Virginia to his state.
That's right. So this is something Senator Joe Manchin has been pushing for regulatory approval for this Mountain Valley pipeline, which would run from West Virginia to Virginia. That pipeline is opposed by both Kaine and Senator Warner as well in Virginia. And so, that is a major amendment, being sought by Kaine and some other Democrats.
If any amendment is adopted, this bill would have to go back to the House. Are members of the House in town?
Well, no, not now. They could come back, but I think there's going to be a huge attempt to try to avoid approval of any of these amendments because time is running out. The Treasury Secretary Yellen has said that the Treasury could run out of cash and borrowing room as soon as Monday. So if any amendments are adopted, the House would have to act very fast. And that certainly is possible that could happen. But I think that there's going to be a real effort to try to pass this without any amendments being adopted.
We're talking with Paul Krozak from CQ Roll Call. The U.S. House vote on this debt limit and spending cut bill last night was bipartisan in all ways, meaning that the yes votes had Republicans and Democrats and the no votes had Republicans and Democrats. What does final passage look like from the commitments from the senators so far that we've heard? What would it look like?
Well, I don't know how many, yes votes we're looking at. But, I think, it seems pretty clear that this is going to pass eventually. And I think you will probably get a majority of Democrats voting for this, and you might, I don't know, maybe half of Republicans, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe a little bit less, something like that, I would say.
The House Republicans who voted no on Wednesday night are very angry at the approach that Speaker McCarthy took in these negotiations. Are there any similarly angry Senate Republicans?
You know, we haven't really heard that yet. Yeah, we haven't, and I think that's partly because the Senate basically let the House and President Biden negotiate this deal. And so, yeah, there were some complaints in the House from Republicans saying, you know, we should have been kept, you know, up to date on these negotiations as they were happening. We should have been briefed. But since the Senate was not playing a major role in these negotiations, we haven't heard complaints from senators that they were not being kept abreast.
And finally, are there any other Senate debt limit storylines that you've noticed?
Yeah, you know, I think a very interesting one is that one of the provisions in this bill, it's a 1% automatic cut. If all the appropriations bills are not passed by the end of the calendar year, there would be an automatic 1% cut that would take place across these appropriations bills if they're not all passed. And it's still, the details of that are still a little bit unclear, but one thing that is clear is that if that sequester were to happen, it would cut defense. Defense would be cut, but actually, looking at next year, non-defense would go up above the levels negotiated in the deal. So there's concern among Republicans that this could be an incentive to Democrats to not pass all the appropriations bills in time, because if they don't pass all those bills in time, non-defense actually would go up and defense would go down. Now, a second way to think about this is this could give Democrats leverage in pushing for higher non-defense spending in an omnibus, with the thought that Republicans will accept the higher non-defense spending in order to avoid this 1% sequester. So there is concern about that, and again, the details are still not totally clear, but this could be an issue going forward.
Paul Krozak, senior writer with CQ Roll Call. Find his stories at rollcall.com and on Twitter at Paul Krozak. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
And while the Senate leaders are negotiating over which amendments will be allowed to be offered to the debt limit and spending bill, and again, it's because any single senator can hold up a bill, so by getting an agreement to have your amendment voted on, you yield back some of the time that you otherwise would have. While that's all happening, some of the senators coming to talk about what amendments they would like to offer, including Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, on defense spending.
I've heard House leaders suggest this bill fully funds the military. For that to be true, you'd have to believe that the military is okay if you cut their budget $42 billion below inflation. The party of Ronald Reagan would never allow inflation to reduce defense capabilities. This bill, the top line number, locks in less ships for the Navy at a time China is going to expand dramatically. In 24 and 25, we're going to cap spending at a level that we cannot expand the Navy, and in the same period of time, China's going to go from 310 ships over a 10-year period to 440. Less money for the Marines, less money for the Army, less ships for the Navy at a time of great conflict. Not a penny in this bill to help Ukraine defeat Putin. They're going on the offensive as I speak, and we need to send a clear message to Putin that when it comes to your invasion of Ukraine, we're going to support the Ukrainians to ensure your loss. If we don't do that, then we're going to snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. Senator Cotton I'm going to yield to him. He has a time problem. But we're going to take some time here to explain to you why those of us who believe that the number one job of the federal government to defend the nation, that concept has been abandoned, and that we are going to insist and fight until we find a way to rectify some of this harm.
Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, on the floor with Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, and some other Republican senators talking about the amendment that they plan to offer to the debt limit and spending cut bill to increase defense spending. Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, spoke on the Senate floor Wednesday afternoon while the House was still debating and moving to a vote on this bill, talking about his opposition due to the change in work requirements in the bill for some recipients of SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Madam President, at a time of massive wealth and income inequality, at a time when the people on top have never had it so good, while the middle class shrinks and millions of working class families live in desperation, I cannot in good conscience vote for a bill that takes vital nutrition assistance away from women, infants, children, and seniors, while refusing to ask billionaires to start paying their fair share of taxes. So again, not as bad by any means as the bill passed in the House. This bill will cut nutrition programs for kids and the elderly, and yet the billionaires continue to laugh all the way to the bank. They don't have to pay a nickel more in taxes.
Senator Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont, on the Senate floor Wednesday, talking about the debt limit and spending cut bill that the House passed Wednesday, sent to the Senate, now considering it on this Thursday. Today on the Senate floor, Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, talking about an amendment that he would like to offer to the bill that would cut 5% across the board all government spending on budget spending over the next 2 years. He says to get to a balanced budget.
If you made $100,000 a year and your mortgage payment was at $10,000, is there any chance you would ever default? Is there any reason you wouldn't cut your other expenditures to prioritize your interests so you don't get kicked out of your house? That's what every American family would do, but we don't do it up here. So we threaten default. We scare the markets and say, oh, no, we'll default if the debt ceiling doesn't come up. No, we would default only if we refuse to cut spending. So we spend $1 trillion more than comes in every year. That's the problem. If we simply said, we're going to pay the $500 billion, 10% of our revenue for next year, we're going to pay the interest no matter what, and guess what? We'll tell the marketplace we're never going to default. We are never going to default. We will always do that. That would be great. The market would go gangbusters and say, we no longer have to worry about those knuckleheads. They've finally decided they're going to pay their interest, and they always will. Then what would happen? Well, we wouldn't have enough money for everything. So then we should look at where we could save money. The problem has always been this. Republicans point at Democrats and say, we don't like your programs, let's cut your programs. Democrats look at Republicans and say, no, no, don't cut our programs, cut yours. Everybody's, don't cut mine, cut yours. That's why I've taken the approach and continue to take the approach, we should cut everything across the board. In the past, there were always like conservatives who say, let's get rid of public television, let's get rid of Sesame Street and Big Bird, and they'd get so much grief over it. It's like, why do that? You're not balancing the budget over Big Bird. Take 1% of Big Bird's budget. Take 1% of everybody's budget. And what would that bring about? It would bring about more conservation of the dollar. It would bring about more restraint and more reform.
Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, on the Senate floor today, talking about an amendment that he would like to offer to the debt limit and federal spending bill. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, also talking about an amendment that he would like to put forward. In the bill, there is approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline Project. It's a natural gas pipeline that would run from West Virginia to Virginia. Here's Senator Kaine.
It would be one thing if you could build pipelines in midair, but you can't. To build a pipeline, you have to take people's land. Sometimes the land you take might be public land, national park or national forest. But in any pipeline project of size, and the Mountain Valley Pipeline is about 330 miles long, you have to take a lot of land from private landowners, most of whom don't want to give up their land. That means that when you do a pipeline project and you approve it and you give a private company the right to take people's land, you ought to do it carefully after significant deliberation. And so since the 1930s, there has been a pipeline permitting process that has required for an interstate pipeline, first a determination by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that there is a need for the pipeline, the gas pipeline. And then once that determination is made, a separate determination has to be made about what is the best route for the pipeline. And once those determinations are made, you're able to take private land to build the pipeline, even though those landowners will never benefit at all from having a pipeline cross their property. Then additionally, the permitting process isn't just about building, but it's about holding the developer to strict standards so that when they build the pipeline, they minimally disturb the land, they minimally affect species, they minimally affect creeks and streams and river crossings.
Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, on the Senate floor, talking about an amendment that he would like to offer. So far, no amendments have been offered to the debt limit and federal spending bill that passed the House yesterday, now before the Senate. And the debt limit, the Treasury Department says, will be hit on Monday if this whole package of $1.5 trillion spending cut over the next decade, plus suspending the debt limit for 18 months, does not pass the Senate and get signed into law. And in this bill, as well as approval of this Mountain Valley Pipeline project, Senator Kaine wants to offer an amendment to cut the pipeline. The senator who inserted that provision, or had it inserted, supported the insertion, was Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, also a Democrat. He spoke on the Senate floor against this proposed amendment.
Mr. President, I rise to speak in favor of the MVP. They call it the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I call it the most valuable pipeline that we have to offer energy to the people of America. And it's been under tow for a long time. I brought some illustrations of what we're going through because my good friend from Virginia, the senator from Virginia who just spoke, and we respectfully disagree on this. This is something we've worked on for an awful long time. And first of all, I want to make sure everybody understands, you cannot get permission to move forward on a pipeline, transmission line, anything that you want in this country unless there's a market for it. You've got to show that there's a person or a group or a market that this product, whether it's electricity on transmission lines or gas in the pipelines or oil, whatever, there has to be a market. It can't go from here to there and then try to build a market. So there has to be a need. There has to be a need. If there's going to be a need in the market, then it says proceeding. And then it goes through the process. This has started over 8 years ago, going through that process. I don't think there's another permit that's ever been scrutinized or request for a permit than this Mountain Valley Pipeline, or we'll call it the MVP.
Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia and chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on the Senate floor today. Senator Mike Braun also speaking on the floor about an amendment that he wants to offer to the debt ceiling and spending cut bill to automatically lift the debt ceiling the next time the limit is reached, but also include a provision that would reduce spending if the annual appropriations bills are not passed on time.
I'm here going to introduce an amendment called the No Default Amendment. We should not be flirting with this year after year when we know it's going to happen anyway. And until we put real reforms into the system, expect the same. The next time we hit the debt ceiling, when the Treasury says you're entering into extraordinary measures, that's when the clock starts. My amendment, if you can't get a real deal done with reforms addressing the things I've talked about, we're going to start paring back this place, and it's going to be across the board. Defense and domestic spending. Every 30 days, a 1% cut. If you are so thick-headed that you can't get it done then, another 30 days, you do it again. That would put some rigor into the process. But if we're not honest with the public and really address the programs that are dearest to most Americans, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, quit doing mandatory spending on things that aren't important, we're going to run this place into the ditch. And I fear for what my kids and grandkids are going to have to deal with, and I think all Americans should be worried about that. This would be at least the start of putting a little bit of discipline into an undisciplined system.
Senator Mike Braun, Republican from Indiana, on the Senate floor as senators come to the floor talking about amendments they would like to offer to the debt limit and federal spending bill. Negotiations underway for which amendments can be offered in exchange for yielding back the time that the senators have under the procedures of the Senate that could delay passage of this bill until or beyond the Treasury Department's deadline for suspending the debt limit, which is Monday, to avoid a default. As always, you can follow the Senate live on C-SPAN 2 television and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. On Wall Street today, the Dow up 153, NASDAQ up 165, S&P up 41. Yahoo Finance story has this: stocks popped on Thursday after the House passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling late Wednesday evening, and the focus on Wall Street turned to Friday's all-important jobs report. The story from Reuters: Philadelphia Federal Reserve President Patrick Harker on Thursday said that while high inflation is coming down at a disappointingly slow pace, the U.S. Central Bank may not need to raise interest rates much to hurry the process along. He said in remarks prepared for delivery to a National Association for Business Economics webinar, "I am closely monitoring incoming data, listening to our contacts and audiences, and evaluating economic conditions to assess whether additional tightening will be needed." At the same time, Federal Reserve Board of Governors member Philip Jefferson hinted that the Fed might pause interest rate increases at its next meeting, which is Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. But he also said that does not mean the Fed will not raise rates in the future. Philip Jefferson spoke Wednesday at a conference in Washington, D.C.
Since late last year, the Federal Open Market Committee has slowed the pace of rate hikes as we have approached a stance of monetary policy that will be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. A decision to hold our policy rate constant at a coming meeting should not be interpreted to mean that we have reached the peak rate for this cycle. Indeed, skipping a rate hike at a coming meeting would allow the committee to see more data before making decisions about the extent of additional policy firming.
Federal Reserve Board of Governors member Philip Jefferson at the 22nd Annual International Conference on Policy Challenges for the Financial Sector in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday. Back to the U.S. Senate today, senators joined the House in passing a bill to overturn President Biden's college student loan debt forgiveness plan. That plan would allow almost 40 million borrowers of federal student loans to receive up to $20,000 in debt relief each. And the bill passed today would also reverse the president's latest student loan repayment pause extension. The Senate vote was 52 to 46. Voting yes, all the Republicans, plus 2 Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and John Tester of Montana, and 1 independent, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. The bill was considered under the Congressional Review Act, or CRA, which lets Congress kill newly enacted federal rules and regulations, and the CRA bill is not subject to a filibuster, so it requires a simple majority to pass the Senate rather than the 60-vote threshold for most other legislation. President Biden says he will veto this bill. Here's some of the Senate floor debate before the vote. John Thune of South Dakota, Republican, supporting overturning the president's plan.
There are 2 main parts to the president's scheme. There's the outright forgiveness of $10,000 in federal student debt, or $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients, which is set to cost American taxpayers somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 billion. And then there's the president's radical revamp of the income-driven repayment system, which will bring total cost for the President's plan to somewhere close to $1 trillion. Now, Mr. President, there are a number of obvious problems with the President's plan for forgiving student debt. I say forgiving student debt, but it's more like transforming the cost of student debt, or I should say transferring the cost of student debt from the relatively small percentage of taxpayers in this country with student debt to American taxpayers as a whole. It's something of a slap in the face to Americans who chose more affordable college options or worked their way through school to avoid taking on student loans, or whose parents scrimped and saved to put them through college. It's also a slap in the face to members of the military who signed up to serve this country and earned GI Bill benefits to help with tuition or training. Not to mention that negating this popular benefit could drag down recruitment and retention. And of course, it's deeply unfair to ask the many Americans who worked hard to pay off their loans or who never pursued college in the first place to take on the burden of student debt for individuals who took out loans for college or graduate school and agreed to pay them back. And let's remember, Mr. President, we're asking taxpayers at large to foot the bill for student loan cancellation for Americans who enjoy greater long-term earning potential than many of the Americans who will be helping to shoulder the burden for their debts. The President's student loan giveaway isn't a government handout for the needy. It's a government handout that will be disproportionately beneficial to Americans who are better off.
Senator John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, on the Senate floor. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State, opposed this bill, meaning she supported the President's student loan debt relief plan.
It is hard to overstate how badly the student debt crisis has strained our borrowers and our families nationwide. And this crisis has been a drag on our whole country and our economy. It is holding people back from starting families or starting a business or buying a home or, in many cases, just making ends meet. The student debt relief President Biden announced last fall is life-changing for so many borrowers. Under his plan, tens of millions of people who are struggling with student debt will finally see their balances go down, and millions will have their debt wiped out entirely. Before Republican interests sued to deny borrowers this life-changing relief, putting President's plan on pause, over 26 million people across all 50 states had already applied for or were automatically eligible for that relief. And let's be clear, this relief is targeted to reach those who need it the most. 90% of the relief will go to borrowers earning less than $75,000 a year. That's such a big deal. I've heard from so many people across my state who were so grateful and relieved to have a glimmer of hope finally, to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And now Republicans want to snuff it out. They're trying to deny relief to borrowers in court and now here in Congress too. That's what we're voting on today.
Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State, also chair of the Appropriations Committee, today on the Senate floor before the Senate passed this bill by a vote of 52 to 46. The House passed it last week, 218 to 203, two Democrats voting yes, along with Republicans in the House, Jared Golden of Maine and Marie Gluesenkamp Perez of Washington State. President Biden says he will veto the bill, and overriding that veto will require a two-thirds vote of the House and Senate, which is more than the initial vote totals that passed the bill. President Biden's plan also the subject of a pending Supreme Court case. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Listening to programs on C-SPAN through C-SPAN Radio just got easier. Tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio, and listen to Washington Journal daily at 7 a.m. Eastern, important congressional hearings and other public affairs events throughout the day. And weekdays at 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. Eastern, catch Washington Today for a fast-paced report on the stories of the day. Listen to C-SPAN anytime. Just tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcast and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado, commencement ceremony. President Biden, the keynote speaker. The graduates will be commissioned into the Air Force and Space Force. President Biden began with a long-standing tradition at these speeches, forgiveness for minor infractions.
So before I forget, since I was one of those schools at a state university, I found myself in a little bit of trouble a couple times. I really wish that a commander-in-chief had spoken at my graduation, because I have the power to hereby waive any confinements or restrictions of minor cadet disciplinary systems violations. They're waived. Man, I wish at my commencement the Speaker had that power.
President Biden at the Air Force Academy commencement, going on to tell the cadets that they are graduating at a time of great changes and challenges.
Resilience, creativity, endurance, commitment. These have been essential parts of your unique academy training. And you're going to need those qualities as you continue your careers, because the world you're graduating into is not only changing rapidly, the pace of change is accelerated as well. We're seeing proliferating global challenges, from Russia's aggression and brutality in Europe to our competition with China and a whole hell of a lot in between. From growing instability to food insecurity to natural disasters, all of which are being made worse by the existential threat of climate change. I don't hear many of my friends anymore saying there's no climate change. We're finally figured it out. Been trying to push that since 1981. But we're seeing engaging technology, emerging technologies. All AI, from AI and 3D printing, that could change the character of conflict itself. Not going to be easy decisions, guys. I met in the Oval Office, in my office, with 8 leading scientists in the area of AI. Some are very worried that AI can actually overtake human thinking and planning. So we got a lot to deal with. Incredible opportunity, but a lot to deal with. We're also working across multiple domains, developing new capabilities, like our new next-gen B-21 Raider. And you're going to be flying that sucker. And we're going to count on you to keep us at the forefront of air and space dominance, enabling an entire joint force to be stronger.
President Biden giving the commencement address at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The Academy tweeting some stats about the graduating class, writing today 921 new second lieutenants are graduating, 651 men, 270 women. Of the 921 graduates, 12 came from Cambodia, Jordan, Republic of Korea, Malaysia, Peru, Poland, Romania, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Thailand, and Tunisia. And approximately 230 of the graduates, 25% of the graduating class, will proceed directly to graduate school as their first assignment. And another tweet from the Academy, graduates entering active duty will incur a 5-year service commitment and an additional concurrent service commitment depending on the type of training or scholarships they receive. Those tweets from the Air Force Academy. Also, President Biden at this commencement tripped and fell on the stage at one point. He dropped to his knees. He was helped back up to his feet by officials there. Then he pointed at a black sandbag on the stage as the cause, presumably, of the trip. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre telling reporters traveling with the president that the president is totally fine and that he boarded Air Force One with a big smile. An article from AFP, the United States will open its first diplomatic post north of the Arctic Circle in Norway as climate change raises interest in the region. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced Thursday the so-called observation post, generally staffed by a single American diplomat, will open in Tromsø, the largest city in Norwegian Lapland, and be the northernmost U.S. diplomatic facility. The United States, nearby Russia, as well as China, have increasingly viewed the Arctic as strategic as climate change decreases ice in the Northern Ocean. That from AFP. Secretary Blinken talked about this at a news conference in Oslo, Norway, at a meeting of NATO nation ministers.
Final question goes to Vilde Weekend with Aftenposten.
Yes, Secretary Blinken. With increased tensions with Russia and Sweden and Finland joining NATO, has the Nordic region become more important for the United States? And can you elaborate a little bit on what the American presence post in Tromsø will entail? And can we also expect more American military presence in our area and in the high north? Thank you.
Thank you. A few things. First, when it comes to Norway, when it comes to Finland, when it comes to Sweden, we of course have long-standing relationships, bilateral relationships with all three countries that we very, very much appreciate. And I think you've seen over the years, we've been working in a variety of ways with all three countries when it comes not just to security, but to trying to deal with challenges both in Europe and in the region, but also well beyond, to include the Arctic, but also to include global challenges, food security, energy security, global health, et cetera. So those partnerships have been vital for a long time. But now we have the development that Finland has joined Norway as a NATO ally, and Sweden will soon do the same thing. So that only enhances and strengthens the incredibly strong foundation that we've had. For us, the presence post in Tromsø is really an ability to have a diplomatic footprint above the Arctic Circle. And as I said, it's the first one that we've been able to have. Our entire approach is to make sure that the Arctic remains an area of peaceful cooperation. It's one of the things that, especially in a world that is ever more challenged, that it's also ever more vital to preserve, and we're determined to do that. We engage with indigenous peoples in the region. We're very focused, of course, with our partners on dealing with many of the challenges of climate change, natural resources, and fundamentally working together to make sure that the region remains peaceful. And I think having a diplomatic presence further north will only further enable and enhance those efforts. But again, when it comes to the three countries, we're building on a base of very strong bilateral partnerships, and soon having all three as allies in NATO.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at a news conference in Oslo, Norway, during a NATO ministerial meeting. Also there, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He held his own news conference, and he talked about Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO.
Our focus today was on how we can bring Ukraine closer to NATO, where it belongs. NATO is already providing unprecedented assistance. I'm confident that Ukrainian forces now have the capabilities they need to liberate more occupied land. But we need to do more. We are working on a multi-year package of support with robust funding. This will ensure Ukraine's deterrence and defense for the longer term, help rebuild its security and defense sector, and transition Ukraine from Soviet-era doctrine, equipment and training to full interoperability with NATO. We also discussed upgrading the existing NATO-Ukraine Commission to a new NATO-Ukraine Council. This would be a significant step to establish a joint consultative forum with Ukraine, sitting at the table as equals, to discuss key issues for our security. We also addressed Ukraine's membership aspirations. All allies agree that NATO's door remains open, that it's only for allies and Ukraine to make decisions on membership. Russia does not have a veto. And all allies agree that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And we all agree that the most important thing now is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign and independent state. We don't know when the war ends, but we must ensure that when it does, we have credible arrangements in place to guarantee Ukraine's security in the future and to break Russia's cycle of aggression.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at a news conference in Oslo, Norway, during a NATO ministerial meeting. He also said he'll be traveling to Turkey soon to meet with the newly re-elected President Erdogan to try to resolve Turkey's objections to approving Sweden's application to join NATO. Turkey ratified Finland's NATO accession in March, but says Sweden is protecting members of militant groups that it considers terrorists. Today, June 1st, begins Pride Month, dedicated to celebrating and commemorating lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender pride. Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat from Wisconsin, the first openly gay person ever elected to the U.S. Senate, posted this video.
Hi, everyone. Tammy Baldwin here. The month of June is Pride Month, and we're celebrating the LGBTQ+ community and all the progress we've made to make this country a fairer, safer, and more equitable place for everyone, no matter who you are or who you love. Last year, I was proud to lead the fight to pass the Respect for Marriage Act, which enshrines recognition of same-sex and interracial marriages into federal law. It was a remarkable victory at a time when the future of marriage equality was very much in question. But at the same time as we celebrate that win, we are mindful of the hundreds of right-wing efforts underway that could cause harm to members of our community, and especially our trans youth. In response, we need to elect more LGBTQ candidates to office, because having a seat at the table matters. And we need to do more to counter these right-wing attacks on our families, our schools, and our kids by speaking up and being visible. I hope you get out to celebrate Pride, and thank you for all the work you do for our community.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, Democrat from Wisconsin, posting that video on the start of LGBTQ+ Pride Month. Cities around the country holding flag-raising ceremonies as the gay pride flag raised above usually City Hall. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.